Welcome to Arts and Letters, a fun online series in which I get to talk with interesting creative people. I'm your host, Jenna Gordon. My husband David and I work with writers from all over the country, and we love finding new authors with stories to tell. Tonight's guest is no stranger to us. We've had the pleasure of working with Debbie Chinn for more than 10 years, when we first met her as the executive director at the Carmel Bach Festival. We were indeed lucky when Debbie asked us to assist her in the preparation and publication of Dancing in Their Light, a daughter's unfinished memoir. The proud daughter of Chinese immigrants, Debbie Chinn was born and raised on Long Island, New York. While other children took part in sleepovers, sports activities, and summer camps, Debbie's playground was the world of her family's highly successful restaurant and nightclub, the House of Mah Jong, in Syosset, New York. There, from selling cigarettes at the age of 3 to performing as a Polynesian dancer throughout her teenage years, she forged a very unusual path towards an eventual career as a nonprofit arts CEO. Debbie traces her lineage back 13 generations, each carrying forth values of spiritual growth, eternal learning, the centrality of arts, humanities, and true compassion amidst war, poverty, separation, discrimination, and tragedies. Debbie's maternal great-grandmother, born around 1850, was a young child when discovered in a church lying next to her deceased mother. They were fleeing the Taiping Rebellion in Peking, China, making their way to Shanghai. The first of many twists of family fate arose when a missionary rescued, adopted, and named her Mary Hartwell. It is no wonder that Debbie Chinn has forged a distinguished 30-year career as an arts activist and nonprofit consultant and CEO. Dancing in Their Light is the rest of her story. Welcome, Debbie, and it is so nice to have you with us on Arts and Letters.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Good to see all the names. And hi, Jenna, and hi, David in the background.
Hi, great to have you here. I would like to start out this evening talking more about the roots of your family and the missionary.
Yeah, so surprise, surprise, I have Southern Baptist roots. The man who started my family, his name was Jesse Boardman Hartwell Jr. He was a Southern Baptist missionary who was from South Carolina. So for those in this room who are from South Carolina, you'll see the name Hartwell, and that's Jesse Hartwell on the left. He found a calling to be stationed in China to share the message of salvation among the Chinese. And he was the one that organized the first Protestant church in China, just north of Shanghai. And that was where he found and discovered, as Jenna said, my great-grandmother, who was lying next to her mother. And he raised her, he adopted her, and he named her Mary Hartwell. And Mary Hartwell in the picture is the second woman on the right holding a little baby. And she married a very big man, as you can see. His last name is Kwoh, KwOh, and that is my mother's name, my mother's family name. Behind Kwoh and Mary are 3 boys you'll see standing in the back. The one in the middle, that's my grandfather, Frank. And Frank and the brothers all were raised by Mary Hartwell, so they were steeped in the Western tradition. They worked for Shell Oil, for the railroads, so they had Western connections, which played into our life story in many ways. And I didn't realize this, but for some reason, I always buy gas at Shell, and that's where Frank worked. I just put the 2 together. But anyway, but this is the story of what happens when this family, when Frank and he eventually met a woman named Kate, and they had 8 children. 1 died in childbirth, so there were 7 remaining. And grown-up Frank is now seated on the right next to his wife, and my mother is the tall girl standing on the left, just to the right of Kate. And going around in this family picture is my mother on the left. Behind her is her sister Grace, the older sister Mamie, the older brother Teddy, the only boy. Bertha, and then my Aunt Daisy on the right-hand side, who plays a very prominent role in the building of my book, because I got all my oral history through my Aunt Daisy. And the little girl in the middle is Edie, the youngest sister. But if you take a good look at this picture, this is one of the last pictures of this family intact. It wasn't soon after this picture was taken that the entire family began to separate due to war, due to the Japanese occupation and other circumstances. So this is a very rare, precious photo of a united family. And one of the things that I talk about in Dancing with Their Light is they all managed to come to the United States except for Frank. He decided to stay in China because he had a concubine, and his concubine was my mother's classmate in high school. So there's a whole bunch of stories about that disrupted the family. But I think this is so precious because they were just very simple, innocent girls and families about ready to experience the devastation of war, invasion, and poverty and starvation. So that's the core of Jesse Hartwell. He married a woman named Eliza, and there are San Francisco roots. And I'm tracing back where Jesse Hartwell and Eliza lived in San Francisco. I live in San Francisco. I work in San Francisco, and no doubt I have probably walked on the same streets that Jesse Hartwell did decades ago.
So before we go on, let's talk a little bit about the four women who are on the cover of your book, basically the representatives of those folks in whose light you are dancing.
Yes, so the two women on the left are my two great grandmothers. That's Mary Hartwell on the left. That is the woman who gave birth to my grandfather, Frank. The woman next to her is my other great grandmother. She gave birth to my grandmother, Kate, who was to her left, the second woman on there. And the woman on the far right is my mother. So these were formidable women back in the day that really inspired me through their sense of resilience, their sense of self, their ability to survive, and to keep unified in their faith and their love of family. So when it came time to come up with a title, you'll see that I'm a dancer in the story, but I thought that it's their light that really guides me, and I feel very much a kindred spirit to these four women, and I dedicate my book to my mother in particular.
Yes, so let's just talk a little bit about your mother and growing up, getting close to the departure time.
So for those who don't know, that the Japanese occupied China in 1937. This was a year that my family still remember. It had a devastating impact. And I'll read you an excerpt from the book that I call it the Annus Horribilis. In December 13th, 1937, the Japanese invaded China in what was known as the Nanjing Massacre, or the Rape of Nanjing. For those of you who have read Iris Chang's novels, she describes that in excruciating brutality. The invasion only lasted 6 weeks, but the emotional, psychological, and physical impact on Frank and Kate was felt during their entire lifetime, especially among their children. The Sino-Japanese War lasted from 1937 to 1945, and it was during those 8 years that my mother, Daisy, and Edie, the three younger girls, and their mother, Kate, subsisted on a diet of potatoes and cabbage, which was all they could afford, cooked in water. Now, the sisters tried to grow vegetables, but the ground was so tough and yielded very little growth. But my Aunt Daisy recalls the sisters searching for seeds to plant, and after much coaxing of the soil, some turnips started to come into fruition. But it was common for people to steal from other people's gardens, and so the sisters gave up. Now, my mother and her sisters were well educated, so they were the lucky ones to have gotten jobs. And Mom and Edie worked in a bank, and my Aunt Daisy taught first grade reading and giving singing lessons in school. So music plays a big part in our family at a very early age. But the money they earned was still not enough to buy food. The most they could afford was substandard rice or millet, deliberately mixed with sand.
What do you
I
say
know.
about that? Yeah,
Evil people, right? Evil people. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then along comes your dad.
Well, because my dad, so let's just face it, my dad came here illegally. In 1930, there was the political instability of China convinced Dad's mother to send him to the United States. For those who don't know, the Republic of China, it started in 1911. So it's still a very new republic, remarkably. Before then, China was ruled by emperors, and the last emperor was 6 years old, and he abdicated, and that became the new start of a Republic of China under Sun Yat-sen. So that turbulent time caused Dad's mother to just send him to the United States, where his older brother Eddie had already settled in Buffalo. And I talk about how difficult it was to come here. The only way to get here was by boat. There were no planes really in those days. And so on boat, my father got to Seattle, and with instructions to get to his brother Eddie in Buffalo on the other side of the country. So my dad traveled on the Transcontinental Railroad from Seattle to the end of the line, somewhere in the Midwest, and he connected to New York Central, to his final destination, Buffalo, Central Terminal in upstate New York. Now, during this time, Chicago businessman George Pullman had created the Pullman Porters. These were former Black slaves who left the South after the Civil War and during the Reconstruction era of 1865 to 1877. And George Pullman hired them to serve the white customers on luxury rail cars. And by the 1920s, the Pullman Company was the largest employer of Black men in the United States. And the rising anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States found a resonant chord with the Pullman Porters, who understood the Chinese plight of racism and persecution. And taken under these porters' wings, my dad was kept hidden from sight on the train and allowed to ride the train across the country. But Dad had a job. His job was sweeping up cigarette butts at the end of the night. And ever resourceful, Dad realized there was still unused tobacco in those butts. So he unrolled the cigarette paper, took out the unused tobacco, put them in new paper, and then he and the porters used to smoke that before going to bed. And through the kindness of these porters who sheltered them and other Chinese boys, my dad was able to get from Seattle, Washington to Buffalo for free.
So what do you suppose he ate along the way?
I'm sure my dad was really resourceful. He probably picked up stuff. And my dad was a chemist. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. But he was very much into entrepreneurial. He was an inventor, basic heart. He was an inventor. But I think the porters probably brought him leftover foods that the white people didn't want to eat on the train. There were lots of leftovers. So I think Dad ate pretty well. Dad said he didn't starve because the porters took good care of him.
Mm-hmm.
It's really remarkable, the alignment of the African-American experience and the Chinese experience during this time. There was the huge wave of Chinese expulsion during this period. So that's a whole different story. But the Blacks and the Chinese had at that time a very, very supportive relationship because they understood what it was like to be
strong bond.
erased and persecuted.
Yeah, yes. And so what happened when he arrived in New York?
Finally got to New York. He finally got to Buffalo. He attended Buffalo High School, and his interest in chemistry eventually got him elected president of the high school chemistry club. And
so hold it right there. He spoke no English.
No English.
He was elected the president of the chemistry club.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
He had a fifth grade education. He was a self-taught man. And this carries into what he did to build our business. But this goes back to, he was just built that way. He just was a survivor. He just figured stuff out. But he loved to experiment with things. So he eventually saved up enough money, and then he attended New York University, where he majored in accounting. He'd always wanted to go in business. And one of his professors of accounting was Robert McNamara. For those of you who don't know, Robert McNamara was eventually the Secretary of Defense under President Kennedy and President Johnson. But Dad became a citizen of the United States, and this allowed him to enlist in the military, and he chose the U.S. Marines. And he was eventually promoted to captain, and he was assigned to World War II Intelligence Corps in the 6th Division to probe the whereabouts of secret supplies of Japanese ammunition. This is after the Japanese invaded China. Now, after Japan surrendered to the Allies in 1945, which basically signaled the end of World War II, Dad's division had to go to Qingdao to oversee the surrender of the Japanese troops and to help stabilize Chiang Kai-shek's government. And by doing that, he went to Qingdao, and that is how he met my mother. And these are pictures on the left of my young mother and father in courtship, their marriage. And then on the last side, the story about that is he was in the intelligence, so he knew that Mao Zedong was going to seal the borders. The communists were now involved with a civil war with the nationalists in China, and the communists were gaining strength and would eventually just seal the borders. And with Dad's intelligence background, he knew that, so he got my mother, Kathy, on China soil together.
Yeah.
But
Wow.
he was 34 years old, very, very young. I mean, I'm now of the age where they could be my kids, but they came with nothing. They had to leave quickly because they just couldn't. There was no time to pack. There was no time to do anything but just get out before the border sealed.
So they came with literally nothing.
Came with really nothing except just their desire to make it big and to give something back to this country, which is a part of the ethos that I talk about in my book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So they eventually settled on Long Island, New York. There's in the book I talk about the migration from the West Coast to the East Coast, not without some tragedies. Tuberculosis was the pandemic in the day, and my mother and father had a baby boy, my brother Lowell, who inadvertently contracted tuberculosis along with my mother, and Lowell died at the age of 15 months. And my mother always tells the story about how she never, ever could bear the scent of carnations, because that was served at Lowell's service, because it just repelled her for the rest of it. They were the cheapest carnation. They couldn't even afford a tombstone for Lowell. They couldn't afford anything. They just put a couple of toys in the casket. That's how poor they were. They came with nothing.
And she was in a recovery
In a sanatorium.
sanatorium for quite a while.
The TB, the way they treated TB, it's hard to believe in these days, but they just took out her lung. They just took it out. And that there was really no cure. It was such an early pandemic. And so my mother lived for all of her life, as her young life, with one lung, but she was sent to recuperate in Redwood City. And in those days, there were many sanatoriums for TB patients. There was not a vaccine yet in those days. And so there were numerous episodes about how to treat TB patients. And the only treatment was rest. That's what they just rested. My mother rested in the sanatorium.
Rest and removal.
And removal. And my mother had a huge scar on the back. She was very self-conscious about that. Her left side caved in, and she could never sleep on the left-hand side, on her left side.
Yeah.
And she would say, when I'm in a casket, I want to be on my left side. And I said, but you won't be facing anybody. She said, I don't care. She said she was never able, because that she lay on her left side, there was nothing to support her. So it compromised the way she moved, the way she lay down, and it compromised her health eventually, obviously.
And meanwhile, your father is working and taking care of Kathy.
He has to leave. He now has to leave her behind in the sanatorium, and he goes to New York, where he eventually decides he wants to learn about how Chinese cooks operate. And there's a Chinatown in New York. And he just spent his time going up and down the streets of Chinatown, talking to the chefs, just looking to see what they brought from their home country. And he took my sister with him. So my parents had separated for a while. Then when my mother was better, then she was able to reunite with my father and my sister in New York.
And tell us what led up to those months or years that led up to the beginning of the first restaurant.
Well, so on Long Island, for those who don't know, Long Island was very homogenized then. And there's the first suburb of the United States was called Levittown, created by a man named William Levitt. That was about 8 miles from where we eventually settled in Syosset. And there was a covenant that William Levitt established for Levittown, which basically said he will not sell any of the homes to a Negro. He did not want Black people living in Levittown. So this was very big in Long Island. There was also Robert Moses, who built all the parkways, but Robert Moses also designed bridges that were too low, that buses from New York City couldn't get through with Puerto Ricans and people of color. It's a fascinating history about Long Island in those days. But juxtaposed against that, we were a rare family of color coming into a very homogenized part of the country. However, my father loved people. And so he was told, if you want to make any business connections, join the Kiwanis Club. And he did. And one of the people in the Kiwanis Club was the banker of Long Island National Bank, who took a liking to my dad and gave him the funds to buy an old potato barn. Long Island was potato fields long before it came developed. And Long Island potatoes were a very big delicacy and a commodity way back in the day. And so Dad began to network with the Kiwanis Club and other businesses, and he just pounded the pavement to try to find a way. He started a first restaurant that was called King Wah. It was on a corner lot, and he loved the corner lot. He was into identifying prime locations. A corner lot is a prime location. And he learned, how to work in a kitchen. He learned to experiment. He learned to use his chemistry skills to create different dishes. He never wrote down a recipe. He just started all over again. And that's how they came up with house specials. They tried it on a customer. And if a customer liked it, they got put on the menu. So based on that, he finally was able to leave that and then eventually start the Mah Jong restaurant with the capital investment that the banker gave him to buy a barn for $60,000. And in those days, there was no paperwork. He just shook the hand of the banker, and the banker gave him the money. Everybody loved my dad, right? So obviously we all joined in the family restaurant, the family business. That's what we did. We just had to work there. And my first job was working at Mah Jong restaurant, and I joined the workforce when I was 3 years old. And my first job was selling cigarettes. There were no vending machines in those days, but Mom ordered cartons of cigarettes. And each week, my job was to take out the cigarettes from the cartons and display the cigarettes in a glass case. The case was roughly 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, and it had a glass on the top and the front so the customers could see the cigarettes and cigars for sale. And a sliding glass door at the back allowed me to reach in and grab a pack and go on tiptoe and hand it to the customer on the other side. I arranged the cigarette packs by color. At a very early age, I loved to organize. To the left, the white packs, which were Lucky Strikes and Camel, L&M, Kent, Viceroy, and Tarryton. Then I lined up the red packs, Pall Mall, Winston, Marlboro. Then the blues and the greens, Salem and Newports. And also inside the case was a small dish with a wet sponge, which was a little humidity to keep the cigarettes and cigars moist in that case. And there was a small little change box with a coin slot on top. And eventually, I learned how to give out change from that coin box. Cigarettes were 45 cents a pack in those days. So I would be given $1, and I used to figure out how to hand out change. There were no adding machine tapes. We just mentally calculated.
And I love my memory of this in the book is the way that your mother taught you how to make change.
Yes.
And that you would stack all the little coins up, and at between 3 and 6 years old, you were already doing that.
I was also sort of an accountant. I had to reconcile my cigarette sales, because my mother would make sure that everything that she would count, that we'd count the leftover inventory and what was in the change box, what we took, and I had to write down how much we sold. So I didn't realize it, but I was a baby accountant in those days. So
pushing cigarettes.
Well. Oh, it gets better. So then my mother, so I love to go inside the case and smell it because I love the smell of tobacco. And it was very exotic smelling. And the cigars, they were beautiful in there. The cigars had ribbons and they were just colorful. Cigars were colorful in those days. And I looked at my little canvas there and I was so proud of it. And I just loved to inhale and sell. My mother got a little worried about that. So when I was 6 years old, I graduated to helping Kenny, the bartender, make the garnishes for drinks at the bar. So I impaled toothpicks in olives and onions for the Manhattans, and I used special toothpicks with colorful flags to spear the maraschino cherries and the Manhattans, and for the more exotic drinks like the Singapore slings. And then there were cartons of fresh lemons. Everything was fresh at Mah Jong. No canned or concentrated juices. So fresh lemons were brought up from the kitchen to the bar, and each lemon half was freshly squeezed on a manual juice press with a heavy rotating handle. And sometimes Kenny would put a half lemon onto the round plate and let me pull on the handle. And he said it was good. It's good for your muscles. Now we also squeezed oranges, which was a challenge, but grapefruits, forget about it. But Mah Jong was in a prime location across from Syosset Hospital, in a big electronics store, and about a mile from Grumman Corporation on Jericho Turnpike. And nearby office workers came in and would sit and chat with me. And as a 6-year-old girl on a bar stool putting toothpicks in cherries, I was a bit of a novelty. My mother said, "You're good for business, just stay there." Customers ordered more drinks. And my father just loved it because the bar got busy because people just surrounded me and was talking to me. And I had no intention of being a barfly before I was old enough to drink. Yeah. But this all had educational value because it taught me how to engage in small talk and to put people at ease, which is what I have always done in my career as working in development and fundraising, and now as a CEO. And those were the foundations of my career, not selling cigarettes, but learning how to sell, learning how to upsell. I tried to add a cigar to a cigarette pack for like 50 cents and got to sell more cigarettes. So I learned how to hawk it, basically.
Was it fun? Did you have fun doing this, or did you?
Blast. I thought everybody had a restaurant. We didn't go home. We just stayed. We woke up. Mom drove us to the restaurant. We worked, and then I did my homework at the restaurant, and I would come. We'd eat there, and I thought everybody had this kind of a set. I had no idea until one classmate said, "Oh, we're having dinner at our house." I thought, "Oh, you dinner at the house? Interesting." The concept was so far. All I knew was restaurants at a very early age, and I thought everybody had their teachers. Our teachers used to come into the bar. This was very interesting. They had different personalities at the bar. So I also saw them in school the next day. And I knew which teachers got a little lubed up. So I had a very interesting relation with my teachers as a young girl. I was a quiet student, but I was actually I was a chatterbox at the bar. I felt very comfortable there. Still do.
And you've been chatting ever since.
Chatting ever since. Yeah.
So do you remember the conversations that people would have with you?
I do. They'd ask me about school, and I didn't know I said school was fine. They'd ask me just certain things like, what's your favorite food? Or when I wasn't working at the bar, I would also make wontons. We made fresh wontons, peel the snow peas. So we did a lot of kitchen prep too. And so the customers would just ask general things, what do you like to eat? And, what are you learning at school? But I didn't learn to read. I wasn't reading at the age of 6 yet, so I didn't know what to say. But I just chatted they love to talk about sports. And what I've learned is that even though I don't know what people are talking about, I just sort of smiled and I just sort of kept listening. I kept listening to people, and I learned the art of listening as well. And they were it was just a very interesting environment to grow up in. It was loud, the cocktail shakers, the cacophony, the cash register going off. I remember growing up in that noise, which is a comfort to me. I hate to say it, but I'm very comfortable in a bar. So,
why not? Give us a little visual of you making pot stickers.
Well, so the waiters would they made the meat fresh at Mah Jong. Everything was fresh. So to make the wonton stickers, they would get fresh noodles from Chinatown and noodle wrappers, all fresh. And Dad would go into Chinatown, which is about an hour each way, to pick up fresh noodles every morning and bring them back. And the noodles and the chefs would cut them into the sizes of wonton square sizes, and then they would make the meat filling, and they would take this big waiter's tray and plop like a 3 foot mound of meat on there. And my brother and I and the waiters would sit around with our fresh wonton wrappers, an egg wash, and a knife, and we would just take scoops and we would twist and roll. And those were for the wonton soup or fried wontons. And then my brother and I had a race to see who could make the most wontons, like in an hour. And I figured out the way to win. Don't put any meat in it. My mother busted me. Customers complained there's no meat in some of the wontons. So I got fired from that job as well. But it was just really great they don't do that anymore. In restaurants, it's too labor intensive to make fresh wonton. It took hours to put those together, and you never froze the wontons. You try to make enough for who you thought would be coming in for dinner that night. So you just guessed at it, and then whatever leftover wrapper was left behind, they got fried and they got made into fried noodles that were used for with duck sauce to put on the table as guests walked in. So we didn't waste anything there.
And remind me and tell our guests about the concoction that you made when you were supposedly refilling the soy sauce.
I know. My mother went prematurely gray because I'm sure of it. But I think I sort of inherited my dad's love of chemistry or experimenting. But you have to do sides, right? So about 3 o'clock, when the lunch crowd is out, before the dinner crowd comes in, I had to go and restack the sugar packet. Sugars were in packets in those days. Soy sauce was in bottles. They weren't in little packets. They were in actual bottles, little cruets. And there was salt and pepper shakers on the table. Those were on every table, set on tablecloths. Mah Jong was a very a formal place, but it was not an expensive place. So in going through and trying to fill the soy sauce bottles, or I would take my Coke and I go around the tables and I think, hey, I'll try a little Coke in the soy sauce bottle, little pepper, and I shake it up, and I go to the next table and make another elixir of some kind, and then customers finally complained that the soy sauce was rancid and it tasted like carbonated soda, and my mother finally figured out that I'd been there. So
little did they know that charming little girl at the bar was poisoning them at the table.
Exactly.
Before we move on, let's just for a moment see that lovely picture of your family and the sort of at the beginning of Mah Jong. I think it is the first anniversary. Is that the first anniversary picture?
That's first anniversary. That's my sister, my grown-up, my sister on the left, my brother, and me. I'm 3 years old in that picture, roughly 2 or 3, and my mom and dad. And on the left is a picture of my mother and father during Chinese New Year, which was a very big celebration at Mah Jong. Mah Jong was open every day of the year, every single day except 2. Chinese New Year. We closed the restaurant for a big banquet, and we donated all the proceeds to the Chinese Cultural Center of Long Island, because mom and dad realized that when the communists took over China, they just destroyed all the cultural artifacts and history. And it was very important to them to work with an organization like the Cultural Center to preserve cultural heritage. And so they just gave all the money back to the Chinese Cultural Center. And this was a huge 2-day celebration with a lion dance and gongs and firecrackers and dancing. And I talk a lot in the book about after all of the public were finished with the banquet, my father turned the Mah Jong dining room into a gambling den, and all the chefs came out and waiters came out. And I talk in the book about how I grew up around gambling, and I stood by waiters as they were playing poker or dominoes, and if I stood by a waiter and they had a winning hand, they'd give me a couple of dollars. And so I learned to look for the waiter that had the body language that looked like he was winning. So, and I made a lot of money. I made $400 one year, which was, I was like 10 years old. And I thought, this is really easy. It's pretty good money for looking cute. And then I grew up learning to love to gamble. My father was a big gambler, got us in trouble many times. But that was the kind of the characteristic of this restaurant. It was, everybody began to come to it because it was so good. The food was exquisite. It was what I call radical hospitality, fanatical hospitality, that I have embedded in every single organization that I've run. I want every business that I run to feel very much like you're coming to a home. You're coming back. You're coming among a community, and I feel that that's a missing ethos. So, in every place I go, I want people to feel like they're coming into their home.
And then in 1959, you had a little trip to Hawaii, and that changed everything.
Absolutely. So Hawaii became a state in 1959, for those who don't know. And in those days in New York, in Manhattan, there was a Polynesian nightclub circuit in Manhattan. And I talk about Hawaii Kai and Trader Vic's and the Lexington Hotel. They were designed by stage directors who also designed for the Met and for TV shows. And this was a big extravaganza, but there was a fascination with Hawaii. And so we went to Hawaii in 1966. And that was the aha moment for Dad, because it fostered in all of us a love, an unshakable love for the Polynesian and Hawaiian culture. And it was the catalyst for Mah Jong 2.0, because the restaurant was so packed all the time that the small dining room, that old potato barn dining room, was always packed. And so expansion was necessary. And so Dad conceptualized a new dining room at Mah Jong featuring a Polynesian nightclub, inspired by our experiences in Hawaii. And so Dad and an architect named Michael Spector, a very famous architect on Long Island, who was known for changing the face of Long Island, they created the still recognizable stone facade facing the main highway, with stunning floor to ceiling windows and framed by wooden beams bending into a hint of a pagoda. But here's the thing. Transforming the building from a barn to a restaurant and a nightclub was a remarkable feat, because the facade was all stone and rock. And each stone and rock was inlaid piece by piece by a stone and marble company called Antelope. And when we show pictures of construction of the renovation, there are piles of rocks everywhere waiting for sorting, measuring, and cutting and installation. So Mah Jong's new dining room was named the Aloha Room, as an homage to the Hawaiian spirit, and it allowed us to seat another 150 guests. I might also point out that the building that you saw earlier, there was no other building like it in the world. It was custom designed for Dad's specs. And one of my next goals is to try to preserve it from being demolished, because it is now chopped up and it's now commercialized, but I don't think people realize that that building was put together by hand. There were no cranes, there were no machines.
And so let's discuss the floor show. And well, look, just first we'll look at this. These are the stones that he's talking about.
All that stone, every one of those little stones and rocks had to be just measured to also give a sense of this diversity and the different shades of the stones. There was great care. And that's why this is a remarkable, unique building. Truly, I think it's historic.
And this room with the curtains, is that the main dining room?
That's the Aloha Room. That's the extension.
That's the Aloha. That's the new part.
That's the new part.
Goodness, yeah. And when did the arch that you are sitting in front of right now, when did the arch go in? That went in a little bit later, I believe.
For those who don't know, this is I'm not really sitting in front. This is the Mah Jong dining room after my dad did another renovation. This is in the late 1970s, but he created this big arch for dramatic flair to move into the original dining room.
Yeah, I love that picture so much.
But the Polynesian entertainment, so that was the Aloha Room, and but you have to find entertainment, right? So Dad was referred to a woman named Leah Kirk, who was a steel guitarist, and whose recording troupe, Leah Kirk and the Hawaiians, had been prominently mentioned in Hawaii society columns. In 1950, the Honolulu Star Bulletin's Reporting from New York column by Ann Koga offered an off-the-beaten-track nightclub near Lexington Hotel in New York, featured Leah and her husband, Bill. There was a place called the Ringside Cafe at 8th Avenue and 49th in Manhattan, and it was within the thriving Polynesian nightclub circuit in Manhattan. But the writer also says that Leah was born near Hilo on the Big Island, and she's a member of the Hokia family there on her mother's side. She left the islands when she was a youngster, and she played all over the mainland. And last summer, Leah and Bill made an album of Hawaiian songs on Signature Records. Leah is one of the first women guitar players to become a recording star. And that's what she looked like. And I describe in my book that, to me, she was my Hawaiian Ethel Merman. She had a booming voice. She smoked constantly, and she would always have a cigarette on her hand. She never really flicked the ashes. She just let the cigarette get to be, the ashes get to be glowing at the end. And I always thought she held a glowing worm. And then when it came time for the ashes to tip over, she just cupped her hand and just flicked the ashes in her hand. I thought it was magical. But she was a larger than life woman. And she played a mean steel guitar. She was an accomplished musician. Very rare for women headliners to do that in those days. And so a Polynesian show is incomplete without a sword and fire dancer. And so
Yes.
a true Samoan chief, his name was Chief Taofi, and he thrilled and terrified the audiences with his knife throwing and his flame throwing. And so there's Chief Taofi. So you see the knife there. Look at those hooks at the end. And that is Taofi doing the fire dance. You can see he's got that's real fire.
And that's burning on the ends of the
soles of his feet. Mm-hmm.
But it's also he's holding a knife, or what is burning actually there?
So he's got the knife, and around the knife is benzene-soaked rags.
Yeah, right.
On both sides of the knife. But that is what a Samoan chief looks like, by the way. He truly is he was royalty, and those knives were quite heavy. And so, it's a novelty. I guess Mom was tired of me selling cigarettes, tired of me putting toothpicks in bars, and tired of me making wontons with no meat. So as a novelty, I was added to the Polynesian floor show when I was 11 years old. And eventually I was trained by Chief Taofi to do a knife dance. And one of Chief Taofi's routines included that Samoan twirling knife that had that very sharp hook at the end. And he would make his entrance by racing on stage with a blood-curdling Samoan warrior cry, the knife held in one hand and a pineapple in the other. And he would strut around the stage, bantering with the audience. And then suddenly he'd lop off the top of the pineapple with the knife to show how sharp the knife was. And then he offered the open pineapple to the guest in the front row, and then he proceeded to do his knife dance. He twirled the blade close to his body as he flipped it in the air, catching it behind his back, avoiding the blade, twirled the knife between his legs, tossing them in the air. Then he hooked the knives together, and he swirled them around, creating a frightening scene because the stage was so small. And the knives came very close to the singers' microphones. This and the fire dance were the only two numbers of the show where photography was not allowed, because in those days we had flash cameras, and the flash cameras would have been distracting and dangerous for Taofi. So, considering this peril, I was stunned when Leah and Taofi asked me to learn this number. So Taofi provided a smaller knife. It was about 3 feet in total length, with a polished wooden handle and a dull blade, but a very sharp hook at the end. And it weighed over 5 pounds. So I learned this routine during the summer. So Taofi drove from Queens, which is near Manhattan, to our home, Syosset on Long Island, on the weekdays to teach me how to dance. And since Mah Jong was always busy, we rehearsed on the redwood deck of our home. So he taught me special routine using only one knife, thank goodness. And I learned how to best balance the knife to build up maximum speed, and my routine with figure-8 movements, spinning the knife in one hand and then behind my back, and then switching to my other hand, twirling the knife between my calves a couple of times. Then I would carefully toss the knife between my leg, catching it with one hand, doing a backflip, and then tossing it in the air, catching it on my back. So we rehearsed this until my arm muscles were well past sore, and I was strong enough to do the number. By the time Taofi thought I was ready, our redwood deck was nicked and dented from all the times I dropped the knife.
And how about you? Did you ever hurt yourself?
Absolutely. I was all black and blue, and I hurt myself, and I was just a wreck. But performing the sword dance was a different story, because I wore glasses during rehearsal so I could see the knife. But we never wore glasses during a performance, and I didn't have contact lenses. So I did this routine with my 2200 eyesight. So sometimes the hook caught my thigh.
Oh.
I dropped the knife while trying to catch it. But Taofi taught me just keep going and have fun, right? The show must go on. Keep going and have fun. And I learned that even though I was totally humiliated every time I made a mistake, I learned how to just work through it, which is kind of what I do as a CEO. But Leah liked to mix it up. So one day she said, hey, you should learn a fire dance. So there was no way I could learn a fire dance like Taofi. You saw what he did with his feet, not with my eyesight. And hadn't I been enough with the knife dance? But Taofi envisioned a fire pit. It was a prelude to his sword number. And this involved me stepping onto the stage, strutting around stage to the sound of the drums before slowly stepping onto a pit of fire. Yes, pit of fire. So to prepare, I had to build calluses on my feet by walking barefoot outside as much as possible, especially on pebbles or any hard, uneven surface. And I practiced on the hot asphalt of our driveway. And after a while, Taofi said, I was ready. So back to the redwood deck we went. So he placed this large industrial walk with a 2-foot metal stand on the redwood deck. And I practiced by stepping up onto the walk, getting my balance, doing some hand motions, and then slowly stepping down 1 foot at a time.
So wait, both feet were in the walk at one time?
Eventually, I had to get one foot up, balance,
right?
Get the other foot up, because the walk is curved.
Got it.
And so I had like balance, and then 1 foot down, the other foot down, and meanwhile you're doing all these hand motions. So after I got used to that, it was time for the fire. So he soaked rags in benzene and put them in the wok, and he lit them. And the fire wasn't that high. It was just up to my calves. Same calves I got.
Excuse me, my favorite line of the book.
It is true.
Say that one more time.
The fire was not that high, just up to my calves. I could have done Joan of Arc when you think about it. The same calves I got caught in the hook of my knife, which they did a lot. But Taofi said to step on the fire 1 foot at a time, then the other, stay 2 seconds. Step off with 1 foot, then the other. Now he demonstrated by years, with feet thickened by years of fire dancing. But do you know how hot fire is on the soles of your feet? It's very hot.
No, I don't.
It's very hot. And I managed to step up, but I leapt off before I could get the other foot on there. It was just painfully hot. So Taofi used the garden hose to spray on my feet. And there was sizzling sounds as he cooled me. Then we try again. And I got a little better at it. I was determined to do it. I got a little better at it. And I could stand in the fire for 2 seconds. Then 3 seconds. Without yelling in pain. And after much rehearsal and now a nicked, dented, and charred redwood deck, I just told Taofi I couldn't learn this number. I didn't want deformed feet. I had enough problems finding a date for the prom. So I told Taofi that no one would take me to the prom if I looked disfigured. So my dramatic pleading, all those early years of selling cigarettes and upselling and cavorting at the bar, that convinced Taofi and Leah that I shouldn't do it, and I never performed that number at Mah Jong. And I have beautiful feet now, I must say.
Yes, great. Well, it's that the most interesting. I mean, I love your whole story, and of course, I know it really well by now because we've been working together for a year and a half on developing this beautiful thing. Uh, and all of that life, that time in the restaurant business, learning to perform, being in front of an audience, gathering people together. Here is the whole ensemble with Debbie and her little brother down there in the middle. And these were your people.
My people, yep. We had a rotating band, and I just was surrounded by these wonderful exotic dancers. They were just exotic people and very talented, surrounded by music all through my life, music and dancing
Mm-hmm.
and singing all through my life, very early age.
Well, I know that I could listen to you and talk to you all night. We only have a few minutes left, and I want to spend a little bit of time on what you did when you grew up and left that performing arts world for another.
Well, I'm an accidental CEO. I was going to major. I wanted to major I want to be a classical pianist because I played music as a young girl. I played guitar and piano, and I'm also quite klutzy. So when it came time for my piano audition, I was just playing field hockey, and I jammed my finger playing hockey, and I couldn't do my audition. So I had to pick another major to go to college, and I picked theater. And so I just teeter-tottered into it, and I had no training. I just learned as I went. I never went to grad school. I don't have an MFA, but I've learned through hard knocks. I've learned by just doing, like my father. I've learned by trial and error, and in many ways that I think has been a great lesson, because businesses are not so rigid nowadays after the pandemic. We've got to be so malleable and experimental and forward thinking about how we keep our businesses relevant. Mahjong lasted decades because of that philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
But the other piece that was that's been ingrained in me is my mother and father were very empathetic, giving, generous people. I talked about that the restaurant was across the street from Syosset Hospital. Now, they would never tell anybody this, but mom and dad would bring food there to the nurse staff and the interns who worked the graveyard shift. They just bring food to just feed them something. And whenever there was a customer who had a child going through surgery, mom would bring a toy from her gift shop and bring them over to the nurse's waiting station to deliver to the child in the room when he or she recovered from surgery. But that's just kind of what they did. They gave to the Little League. They donated everywhere. So my sister and my brother and I grew up in this culture of supporting, giving back, and being selfless. And I didn't know it then, but I was in the world of philanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
Growing up, they donated food to everybody. They never said no. They couldn't give money, but they gave themselves, and they gave food. So that is love, right? That's true love. And they became so successful that they were asked so many times to give donations, and they always gave, even in their retirement years. Little Sisters of the Poor, Easter Seal, their giving was vast. And so for me, growing up in the environment, I realized that this fanatical hospitality, this ethos of caring, is something that I've really centered in every job I've had and every relationship that I had. Coming out of the pandemic, I think it's more essential than ever to care and to take care of each other.
Mm-hmm.
Against the hostility of what we're seeing in the world. But this truly is the aha moment for me of my ancestors who have gone through so much persecution and so much adversity to just keep making it and giving back, serving their community. And we do serve the community. We serve people, we serve the community. And this has been my North Star.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't take this long to realize. It took this long to write about it.
And I really would love to see that picture of Debbie and David at the Carmel Bach Festival before we move on to
Yes, yeah.
That picture to me exemplifies your enthusiasm, not to mention his enthusiasm for the performing arts world and the joy that you have in your work.
Well, I think one of the things that I realized about me being a executive director or CEO is I come from as an artist, right? So I grew up dancing and singing, performing, and I happen to be an executive director that handles the business side. But I'm one of the rare ones, I think, that actually is artistically centered, and
Mm-hmm.
it actually makes me really want to take good care of the artists who do so much to make our society really wonderful and whole. And that's how I've approached my jobs and what I look for in an organization I join. I want that spirit of respect for the artists and the artisans who are of the noblest professions I can imagine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we have come to the close of this beautiful thing. I appreciate you so much. I could talk with you for 2 hours. We did that during the time we were developing the book. We talked every 2 weeks, and we planned an hour, and it was generally 2 hours
Well,
because there was so much to say.
and a lot of this is I talk about, and to be clear to everybody in the room today, this was not all joy and happy and easy times for the family. Mahjong caused a lot of financial pressures in our family. It caused a lot of fights in our family. My mother and father fought constantly. My father loved to gamble. He didn't communicate with my mother. And I'll tell a funny story, that dad loved to gamble. He loved to hang back at the restaurant. He never told mom he was never coming home that night. And she got really mad. So she wrote with big magic marker on the kitchen wall, did not come home that night. And my father came home in the morning. He looked at it. He went to bed, which got my mother even more pissed off. But he did it again. So I was getting ready to go to school, and I walked out and I saw by the curb what looked like my father's pants. And I looked at it closer and I realized that the crotches had been cut out. My mother cut out the crotches of my father. He never did it again. Never did. But that's the spirit of my mother. She was just a force of nature.
That's a perfect way to end this conversation, Debbie.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you. Dancing in Their Light, A Daughter's Unfinished Memoir by Debbie Chinn. It is available wherever books are sold. Please patronize your local bookstore if you were lucky enough to have one. For more information about Debbie Chinn, visit her website, debbiechin.com. And I am Jenna B.B. Gordon, host of Arts and Letters, and I thank you for joining us for this episode. Please subscribe to our mailing list for news about upcoming Arts and Letters online events. We thank you for coming. Thank you,
everybody.
Debbie.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you next time.
All right. See you next time. Thanks, everybody.